Welcome to SIGHTLINE Live, the podcast where we explore how live experiences can fuel year-round marketing. I'm your host, Marie-Elaine Lemire. In this episode, we're talking about how neuroscience shapes brand strategy and live experiences. I'm so excited to welcome Michael Roberts, Chief Marketing Officer at MetLife. Michael uses insights from behavioral science to build trust, shape sponsorships, and design experiences that engage audience and drive meaningful results. Michael, I'm so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, Marie. I'm excited for the conversation.
We recently had a chance to do an interview together that we published into SIGHTLINE where you were talking about neuroscience and how it shapes your marketing strategy. Can you tell us where you've been building your strategy based on cognitive science and how you turn neuroscience insights into actionable marketing decisions?
It's been an interesting journey to come to the place where, cognitive science, both neuroscience and behavioral science, has had, I'd call it a defining impact on how I look at marketing. I would say that as marketers for decades, maybe generations, we have been studying, how to drive behavior, how people make decisions. But I think the last 20 or 30 years of neuroscience research has given us I'd say, a sharper tool set to take what was previously things that were maybe based on experience and instinct in marketers and turn them into kind of measurable mechanisms for driving behaviors and decisions for, customers or intermediaries or other stakeholders. And so what I've been on the journey towards is understanding how to make that an applied part of how our marketers do their work every single day. There's been a lot of discussion and probably a lot of application of very specific concepts in specific situations of behavioral science or neuroscience. But, the journey that I've been on and taking my team on is one where it becomes almost a holistic operating system for the marketing organization. I'll say my inspiration has been a woman named Leslie Zane, who has written books on this topic. So I'll let you take a look at what Leslie has said. But ultimately, the way that it becomes part of an actionable marketing strategy is to leverage it for a research method that emphasizes kind of the neuroscience approach to unlocking the capacity of the subconscious to influence decisions and behaviors, and then creating toolkits around those insights. And so those are the kind of the two mechanisms that we use in order to make it an ongoing part of how we think about and execute marketing on it every day.
So you've been building those toolkits for your team internally to understand how to build their plan and to build their campaign or any marketing approach. Because MetLife is such a big company, how do you make sure that all the decisions are made with neuroscience application?
I will say it's a journey, and I think it's never going to be perfectly consistent. But I think, equipping my teams with those tools, having standards for how we look at the research around brand, around decision-making, both at the business line level, at the enterprise level from a brand perspective, but also down at the product level. We try to make sure that at all of the different levels of abstraction, we're using toolkits and research that align to the ideas, that have been popularized in major books that have come out. We're using consistent tools and mechanisms around the research and the toolkits. But I do think that the other way that this is happening is that these ideas are seeping into kind of mass culture. This is something that I'm seeing more and more in being applied to all sorts of different disciplines. And so I think that's the other part of this. So there is this top down, let's use things consistently, but there's also this bottoms up where as it becomes more part of culture, more marketers are seeing how it can be applied. And so I think both top down and bottoms up are the ways to do it. And look, it's a journey. And it's a journey that we're taking the marketing team on, but we're also taking the rest of the organization on, because our definition of brand is not limited to what we do from a marketing perspective. It's not limited to what we do in terms of just our customer interactions. It's really about everything that the company does in order to influence decisions and behaviors of our customers and stakeholders.
Interesting that you mentioned that culturally we see more marketers using neuroscience to build their strategies. In experiential marketing, we keep hearing about how we want to create experience that are generating emotion, right? So behavioral science tells us that people makes decision consciously and unconsciously. How do you craft brand experience that resonates at both levels?
Yeah. I think this is the interesting thing about looking at it from both a behavioral science and a neuroscience perspective. And so a few things to think about in this space. When we look at the research, we don't look at emotional versus functional as the only way to look at, kind of how we're motivating people to change their behaviors or drive decisions. We look at conscious and subconscious. And subconscious has a mix of functional and emotional, and rational emotional, and conscious has a mix of rational and emotional, and they influence one another. And so trying to parse that and say one's more important than the other, or where is it more important, is a really, really difficult thing. What we do know is we do know that the influence of the subconscious is very significant, and in the subconscious is a lot more malleable than the conscious mind. And so we look at the associations in the subconscious that we can influence. Some of them might be more emotional, some of them might be more functional, but what we look for is to make sure that we're influencing all of the associations, whether they're emotional or rational, that can influence the decision. And so in some ways, I feel like we have over-indexed or improperly used this idea of kind of emotional branding, when it's not only about emotional, it's not only about rational, it's about the influence one has on the other. And those two things are driven by associations. They're driven by memory structures that we are attaching to or influencing. And really, if we focus on those memory structures, the associations, the cognitive biases, that people have, then we can be most effective. If you look at what emotions are for, they're essentially telling us to go towards something or away from something. They're very basic, from a physiological perspective. And so I think we have to look at the more complex view of how the brain works versus just saying, it's emotional versus rational.
So, have you ever worked on a sponsorship or executed a sponsorship where you thought the results would be different? And did you learn anything from those associations that were made or not made?
It's a really interesting question, largely because I think when we think about sponsorships, we think about them kind of over longitudinally, and we expect them to change and evolve over time. And I would say that I think all of our sponsorships have evolved over time as our customers have evolved, and the associations that we're able to drive with the sponsorship have been effective. And so then we need to focus in other areas. And so I think we have to look at these things as ever evolving sponsorships. And this is one of the reasons why I think when we look at sponsorships, relationship becomes such an important part of how we think about evaluating sponsorships. I'll give you an example we had a really kind of hopeful sponsorship a few years ago, and we were working with the other party to try to figure out kind of how this was going to work immediately, how we were going to, drive value over time, and we were in a negotiation period with a non-exclusive letter of intent. Just a few days into the conversation, they pulled out and signed a contract with another sponsor. And so what did that tell me? It told me that wasn't the relationship that was going to be able to evolve kind of productively over time. And so I think in our situation, I use that as just one example of relationships matter, and ability to evolve how the sponsorship works over time is probably one of the most important parts of how we think about sponsorships, because it's going to evolve over time, and not everything will work, but a strong relationship, can move past that and help us, create the mutual value that we expect from a sponsorship relationship.
Definitely. Honestly, I think we have to talk about MetLife's naming rights on the stadium. I can't have a conversation with you for our audience. We need to talk about that, right? In the interview we previously did, you mentioned that the strategy has evolved. What was the original vision behind that decision to get the naming rights for a stadium, and how has it evolved over time?
I think the original vision was tied to the strategy of the company at the time, and the strategy of the company at the time was based on the makeup of the businesses that we had. And we had big retail life insurance business in the U.S., a big retail property and casualty insurance business in the U.S. We had really big retail, intermediate retail distribution in places like Japan and other parts of the world. And so the thinking around the stadium naming rights was a relatively traditional rationale and strategy around, a big retail business. And so it was about reach, and it was about driving awareness of the brand. It was also about creating, I would say, physical availability for a non-tangible product,
Yeah.
which is also a really important part of how we think about, a building or like our building in New York City or the stadium. And so it was a relatively straightforward thing that aligned really well with some of the other sponsorships we had, including Peanuts and the Blimp at the time. But it has evolved because the company has evolved. We are no longer in any kind of retail, the big retail businesses we were in at that time. We left the life insurance business in the 2016, 2017. We left the P&C business both in the US, in 2019. The business has evolved. And so our expectations of what we're doing with that sponsorship have evolved. And now we have matched it to the structure of our business now. And it provides, kind of, I would say, even more value now than even what we may have thought about originally. And part of that is, and I go back to the relationship point I made, part of that is the evolution of the stadium itself. It's now such a much more global kind of venue for acts that are now more global. And the world of entertainment has changed dramatically. And MetLife Stadium is a destination for the biggest, most global acts. And we have a big global footprint. And so we're taking advantage of the evolution that the stadium has had at the same time as we've evolved, our business. And that's because, it's a strong relationship, and we're both committed to realizing incremental value, based on the changes in the strategies of both the stadium and the company.
I think MetLife got the naming rights in 2011, right?
Yes.
So, question for you. Since your strategy evolved, if you were to make the decision today, would you sign the deal?
Such an interesting question. I'd have to say yes, just because I feel like we are getting the value out of the relationship, that is commensurate with, and maybe even, kind of, looking to exceed, kind of the cost is of the investment. And I can see how that value will evolve over time. I also think that we are a intangible product. I mean, it's insurance. It's a collective risk pooled product that, in a lot of cases with life insurance, the purchaser is not the user of the benefit of the policy. And so, having that physical availability for an intangible product, still is incredibly, incredibly important. Also, I think, the equation has changed because of the global nature of our business and the global nature of the stadium. We're hosting the biggest global, sporting events like ever this
Yeah.
summer with the World Cup. And then shortly on the heels of that, BTS is coming to 2 sold out shows. And so the global nature of this kind of asset for us is really, really important.
I mean, the MetLife Stadium is such a known venue now. it seems like it would be hard to just stop having
Yeah.
that naming rights, right? Because MetLife is global, but for example, there's some market like, let's say, Canada. MetLife is not in Canada, but people in Canada know about the MetLife
Yes.
Stadium.
It's another interesting angle to it, Marie, where because of things like the stadium that are known globally, it gives us a kind of a different, freedom to operate, and potentially go other places. Not that there are any plans to do that immediately, but that's a benefit for us, in how we think about the stadium's value going forward.
With those type of large sponsorship, how do you measure success? Because it's kind of hard.
Yeah.
Everybody that goes in the stadium are not necessarily going to sign up
Right.
for life
Right.
insurance or any insurance right after. So how do you measure success?
In a lot of ways, I think we have, and I give a lot of credit to our sponsorship team. We look at the sponsorship not based on just what it returns to us, kind of, transactionally, but we look at the sponsorship in terms of what it enables us to do. And the sponsorship enables us to have kind of reach and to create experiences that would not be available to us otherwise. And so when we integrate the sponsorship into the end-to-end customer journey, where through that journey we're creating value, we can see exactly how it is accretive to the commercial outcomes that we're driving, across multiple channels. And so I think one of the things that I think it's incumbent on marketers to do when they think about these sorts of activities is to, yes, look at the ROI, kind of on the sponsorship itself and the role that it plays. And in our case, it's a very important role that it plays in how we engage with, our customers and intermediaries in the U.S. in particular, and kind of and what it provides for us, more broadly.
So we've talked about your team having playbooks to really make sure that they incorporate cognitive science into their decision making process. For marketers that would want to integrate that more in the way they work, do you have any insights or steps that you would recommend them to take?
There are kind of a number of books and resources that I would absolutely recommend. I mean, The Power of Instinct by Leslie Zane would be the first one that I would recommend, and then there's a whole list of others that these ideas have been around for a good amount of time, but I think they've been applied in marketing and sometimes in narrow places, where people are just using neuroscience techniques to review an ad or something like that. They've been applied in things that are not neuroscience, kind of are called neuroscience, and so there's a little bit of I think confusion on reaction time is not based on memory structures, and people call that neuroscience. And so you can read about that from somebody like Paul Zak, who's a researcher out of Pepperdine University, who's done some seminal research on oxytocin. So that would be
Mm.
another place that I would go. I've spent a little bit of time with Paul and years ago, and he is brilliant and has really some great thinking about this. And so I think starting to think about and look at some of the literature on this is a great place to start.
Yeah, definitely. And for brands without like Super Bowl size budget, what are some ways to create impactful and meaningful life experience?
So I would say that when we look at experiences, in a lot of cases, we're looking at it through that neuroscience lens.
Hmm.
And, and we look for kind of three things. One, we look for kind of where does the experience either reinforce positive associations or help overcome negative associations. And so the the concept there is that you have to have relevance kind of in the memory structure, which means you have more positive than negative associations. Second thing we look at is what we'll call salience, which is how large is the footprint in the memory structure of us. And so if it's a sparse footprint in the memory structure, then the event can actually go and help fill in more nodes that creates a much richer footprint in the memory structure. So we want more positive than negative with relevance. We want a large footprint in the memory structure. And then the third is we want clarity and distinctiveness in the memory structure. And so how do we layer these things on? So more positive than negative, expanding the footprint in the memory structure of the brand, and then making sure that it's clear. And I would say that those three kind of characteristics of experiential marketing can be achieved in so many different ways. Sometimes it can be achieved virtually. If you're attacking, kind of one or more of these aspects of the kind of the memory structure that you're trying to establish. Sometimes it can be, a small event, which is more intimate, which can help create clarity and distinctiveness, kind of for the memory structure that you're trying to influence. And so I think it's not about the budget. I think it's about the goals. And I think, we have enough experience and enough tools now to think through how we create, relevance, salience, and distinctiveness, through experiential marketing.
Do you feel that creating associations and relevance, does it depend on where the customer or the prospect is in the sales cycle, or can you create that at every stage?
I think you can create it at every stage. It's a great question, and I love that question because memory structures can be influenced at any stage in the journey. And I think it's important that, when we think about the neuroscience, our brains work more similarly than they do differently as human beings. And I think we have lost some of that. We've lost the appreciation for some of that as we think about the different stages of marketing. And I think these archetypical things that, drive, positive associations or drive clarity can be addressed at any stage in the cycle and can have a significant impact on how people think. They can drive overcoming cognitive biases, whether it's at the beginning of the process or at the end of a commercial process. And so I think there's a universality to this idea of applying neuroscience and cognitive science to marketing. And I think that universality is based on, kind of what connects us as human beings. Like our cognitive processes aren't that different. We are more alike than we are different as human beings. And I think, we have to take advantage of that as marketers.
I feel like we could do a full season of Sightline Live just on neuroscience and marketing. Before we go, I want to do a quick lightning round with you. So I'm going to ask quick questions. You answer directly. Don't think too much. We want the first answer. And let's do that. So if you could sponsor any event in the world tomorrow, what would it be and why?
Okay, first thing that comes to mind, and maybe this is like a personal bias. I'd sponsor the Metropolitan Opera. They are, I think it's an amazing institution. I think culture, is upstream of politics and societal change, and I think cultural institutions have a really important role. The Met is an institution that has had its struggles, and I think supporting it in order to meet the goals of having culture influence society would be where I'd go first.
Interesting. What's one marketing trend you're quietly skeptical about?
So funny you said that because I was trying not to say that in the previous answer. My skepticism is about personalization. So I tried to be quietly skeptical about it. My answer about the universality of we think as human beings. But I think personalization has, let's say, institutionalized an idea that we're more different than we are similar. And
Mm.
I, kind of just in my experience, in my theory of the world, like I think it's the exact opposite. I think we're more similar than we are different. Now, don't get me wrong. I think personalization has a place in marketing and all of that sort of stuff. But I think I'm a personalization skeptic.
Interesting. I love that. If you weren't in marketing, what career path would you be pursuing?
Okay, so it's lightning round. So the first thing that came to mind was art history. So I and it's a little bit of the reason why I answered the first question as the net. Like one of the most interesting things is to see how art reflects society over time, and I really do believe that art is upstream of kind of social change and politics and those sorts of things. And I think the lessons of art history are so kind of fascinating, whether it's, kind of Western traditions or non-Western traditions. I think it would be really interesting to just trace how trace art history through the lens of political and social change.
You said that's the first one. What's the second?
The second, um, you know, I think, I'm so fascinated by political and social change. I mean, I think it would be probably something in the nonprofit space where we were trying to mobilize communities in order to be able to make the world a better place. Something like that would be my second one. My first one would study it, I'd learn about it. The second one would do it.
So, what would be the theme song of your career? Can you sing it?
If I had only known it was the last time.
Ooh,
So,
love it.
so it's a song by Reba McEntire, interestingly enough, and it was called "If I Had Only Known." Like that's a little bit of how I think about my career, because I think I don't want my career to be. I don't want to be in a situation where that was the question that I'm asking, or the reflection that I have. And so part of what I think about, and why I chose that song is because, I want to make sure that I'm always open and curious to new ideas so that I'm never looking back and saying, if I had only known.
I feel like there's a hidden talent here that we didn't talk about. You're a real singer, right?
I am.
You want to sing us a song?
We'll save that for the next episode.
Okay, so next episode. Perfect. We just got a little bit. Looking forward for the next episode then. So my last question before we go, what advice would you give to someone aspiring to become a Michael Roberts? So a CMO at a global company like MetLife.
So first of all, I would never give someone advice to try to become a Michael Roberts, because I think one of the secrets of getting to senior management positions and kind of any leadership position is authenticity. I would say there's sometimes a feeling that there is a formula for what a leader should be, or how it should be, and yes, there are norms, and so I would. It's not to say that you can do anything you want, but within those norms, or beyond those norms, like authenticity is the most important thing. And I think particularly as we evolve into an age of kind of AI enabled work, authenticity and expertise are going to be the most important things. And so I think my advice would be find how to be your authentic self, within the guardrails of the norms. Figure out which norms you want to break, that help you be more successful. And leadership, is stronger when it's backed by expertise.
Thank you so much. This is super inspiring and it feels accessible. Being authentic, isn't it like something everybody wants to feel?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was a real pleasure to have you on the Sightline Live podcast. And I'm looking forward to welcoming you back, and maybe we'll get a full song. Right?
Thanks so much, Marie. This is so fun.
Thank you.